from Atlanta to discuss the charges, and we welcome you, James Brown. How did all of this trouble begin?
Living in America.
He was born in the dirt roads of the South, abandoned by those who should have protected him, and raised in the shadows of brothels and back rooms. Yet from those ashes rose a voice, a rhythm, a fire so unstoppable it would crown him the Godfather of soul.
It's the sex machine, the hardest working man in show business, the Godfather of soul.
James Brown did not just sing. He commanded. Every grunt, every scream, every beat of his foot against the stage was a sermon. He was a poor boy from Barnwell, South Carolina, a boy who once danced for pennies on the street, who rewrote the language of black music and carved his name into history with sweat, defiance, and pure electricity.
So the Vikings now wants to film James Brown.
Everybody wants James Brown.
Well, you know, James Brown is you. James Brown is you out there. I didn't make James Brown.
But how does a man become more than a man? How does a boy discarded by society ascend to a throne he built himself? The story the world remembers is James Brown, the superstar, the dazzling capes, the revolutionary grooves, the hardest working man in show business. But beneath the legend lies a deeper truth, a story of hunger and hustle, of brilliance and brutality, of a man who demanded greatness even as his demons threatened to consume him. The backdrop was America in the 1950s and 60s, an America trembling between segregation and revolution, Motown's Polish and gospel's raw thunder. While others sang love songs to charm the charts, James Brown weaponized rhythm.
When I first started, he told me, son, y'all the baddest band in the world.
He invented a new pulse, urgent, relentless, ancestral, the birth of funk, the heartbeat of hip-hop, the soundtrack of black pride. But every crown carries a cost. James Brown fought not only with record labels and rivals, but with himself. He would become a symbol of power and self-determination, but also of contradiction. A man who demanded freedom for his people while ruling his own band with an iron fist.
But you just can't play. You don't have the one. I'm like, what the heck is the one, man?
His rise was improbable, his reign undeniable. And his story? It is the story of how rhythm became revolution, of how a child left to fend for himself became a voice that could move nations. Tonight, we're telling the story they tried to silence. This is more than a channel. It's a sanctuary for those who feel every note, who know music heals and haunts, and who believe these stories deserve to be heard, fully and faithfully. So lean in. You're among believers who remember every harmony, every heartbreak, every cry from the stage. This is Echoes of Soul. The curtain drops. The voice carries on. Chapter 1. The Choir and the Chains. Before the world crowned him the Godfather of Soul, James Brown was just a boy left behind. Born in a one-room shack in Barnwell, South Carolina in 1933, he came into a world that offered little mercy. His parents split when he was still a child. His father drifted away. His mother, worn down by poverty, left him to the care of relatives. And so, James Brown grew up half wild, half orphaned, learning early that the world did not give, it took. He spent part of his childhood in Augusta, Georgia, raised in a brothel run by his aunt. Imagine it, a child lying awake at night, hearing laughter and sin through thin walls, the sounds of survival carved into his young ears. While other children were cradled in lullabies, James learned rhythm from footsteps and moans, from the shuffle of cards and the clink of glasses. Yet in the middle of all this chaos, the church called him. The black church, fiery, thunderous, unapologetic, became his first sanctuary. It was in those wooden pews and clapboard sanctuaries where James discovered the power of voice. Gospel choirs shook the rafters, and young James stood among them, his own lungs rising with something greater than himself. There, he learned that sound could be salvation, a cry, a plea, a weapon. But even salvation has limits when poverty is a chain around your ankle. By his teens, James Brown was hustling on the streets, shining shoes, dancing for pennies, stealing when he had to. He carried a dream in one hand and desperation in the other. At 16, that desperation caught up to him. He was arrested for stealing a car and sentenced to 3 years in a youth detention center. And here is the paradox of James Brown. Even prison became a forge. Locked away, he honed his body and voice. He sang for the guards, danced for fellow inmates, turned punishment into performance. They called him Music Box because he could make rhythm from nothing. From bars, from walls, from the stomp of his own restless feet. Prison could have broken him. Instead, it became his crucible. By the time James Brown walked free, he was no longer just a boy. He was a man determined to own the stage, to never be powerless again. This was the first transformation, from abandoned child to unstoppable flame, from the chains of poverty and prison to the choir that never left his soul. And yet, the world had only heard a whisper of what was coming. Chapter 2, Fire on the Chitlin Circuit. When James Brown left prison, freedom was fragile. He had no family wealth, no safety net, no blueprint. What he carried instead was hunger, the kind that gnaws at your bones and makes you claw at the world until it gives way. That hunger found its match in music. Through a friend from the detention center, Brown was introduced to a gospel group called the Gospel Starlighters. But James was no background singer. His voice was too raw, his energy too combustible. Soon, that group evolved into something new. The Famous Flames. This was the mid-1950s, when the so-called Chitlin Circuit ruled black entertainment. These were the clubs, juke joints, and theaters across the segregated South and Midwest that welcomed black performers when white establishments slammed their doors. It was a world of smoke-filled rooms, sticky floors, and audiences who demanded everything you had. If you faltered, they'd let you know. If you soared, they'd crown you on the spot. And on those stages, James Brown became a fire. Every show was war. He danced like a man possessed, his body jerking, splitting, collapsing, rising again. He screamed, growled, moaned into the microphone as if the spirit itself had seized him. The Famous Flames gave him harmony, but James gave them urgency. He wasn't just performing songs, he was baptizing audiences in sweat and electricity. In 1956, they cut their first record, Please, Please, Please. The song almost didn't make it to release. Executives thought it was too raw, too repetitive. But when James Brown fell to his knees, wailing, please, like a man begging for his life, it became a declaration. Not polished, not sweet, just desperate, urgent soul. And audiences felt it. The record sold 1 million copies, dragging James and the Flames out of obscurity. But fame in those years was no velvet throne. The circuit was grueling, endless nights on buses, cheap motels, racism at every stop, promoters who lined their pockets while the band starved. Brown responded not with despair, but with obsession. He demanded perfection from his band, punishing mistakes, drilling routines until sweat soaked the floor. James Brown was no longer just a hustler trying to survive. He was a general, building an army. And the stage was his battlefield. Still, behind the screams and shouts, another hunger grew. For power, for recognition, for the throne he believed was his. And soon, James Brown would stop playing the circuit and start rewriting the rules of the entire industry. Chapter 3. The Crown of Rhythm. By the early 1960s, James Brown was no longer just another name on the Chitlin Circuit posters. He was the headliner, the act everyone came to see, the force other singers feared to follow. But James was restless. He didn't just want applause, he wanted to own the sound itself. Mr. Dynamite, they began to call him, and it fit. On stage, he was an explosion in human form, a blur of spins, splits, and screams. Audiences swore he had lightning in his veins. He wore satin capes and sequin suits, sweat glistening under the spotlight like holy water. No two shows were the same, except for one truth. He gave until he collapsed. And sometimes he really did. But the true revolution wasn't just in his body. It was in the music. James Brown started pulling songs apart, stripping them down, building them back on one thing: the groove. Most soul records followed the tradition of melody-driven gospel and blues. Brown twisted it. He pushed the band to lock into rhythm, tight, unrelenting, hypnotic. Horns became bursts of percussion. Guitar strings snapped in sharp staccato cuts. Drums drove like pistons. And James himself, he became conductor, preacher, dictator. Every grunt, every was part of the beat. Songs like Night Train, Try Me, and I Got You, I Feel Good weren't just hits. They were weapons. They made hips move, feet stomp, nations dance. He once said, "I don't care about melody. Give me the one." That one, the downbeat, became his gospel. He reordered the universe of music around it, and then came the live shows. In 1963, James Brown defied his label and financed his own recording at the Apollo Theater. Live at the Apollo wasn't supposed to sell, but it exploded, capturing the fury of his concerts and climbing the charts. Black audiences claimed it as proof of their power. White America couldn't deny it either. For once, the industry had to admit what the people already knew. James Brown wasn't just an entertainer, he was a phenomenon. Yet success only fed his obsession. Brown demanded loyalty from his band but offered little mercy in return. Miss a note, lose your money. Step out of line, lose your spot. He ruled his band like a kingdom, and he ruled it through fear and brilliance. Still, beneath the capes and the perfection, something deeper pulsed. James Brown was building a sound that would outlive him. A sound not yet called funk, but already rewriting history. And the question lingered, how much power could one man seize before it consumed him? Chapter 4. Say It Loud. The mid-1960s were burning, cities were on fire, civil rights leaders were being assassinated, and Black America was demanding more than promises. Soul music was no longer just entertainment. It was testimony, rebellion, prophecy. And in the middle of that storm stood James Brown. Up to this point, he was known as Mr. Dynamite, the hardest working man in show business. But now, he wanted something bigger. He wanted to be more than a star. He wanted to be a symbol. 1968. The year America split open. Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down in Memphis. Cities erupted in grief and rage. In Boston, officials feared the worst. Riots, chaos, blood in the streets. And then James Brown did something unthinkable. He walked onto the stage at Boston Garden the night after King's death. Police begged him to cancel. Instead, Brown turned the concert into a vigil. From the stage, he preached discipline and unity. He told the audience to stay strong, to hold together, to rise above the violence they were daring each other to unleash. And they listened. That night, a riot was prevented not by politicians, not by police, but by the voice of James Brown. But he didn't stop there. Later that year, he dropped a record that changed everything. Say It Loud. I'm black and I'm proud. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't polite. It was a chant, a war cry, a declaration of identity. For black children who had been taught to hide, it was liberation in vinyl. For white America, it was a shock wave. Never before had a pop hit been so unapologetically black, so fiercely confrontational. James Brown had become the soundtrack of pride. But with pride came contradiction. While he was now a symbol of black power, he also forged ties with politicians who didn't always stand with his people. He courted establishment approval even as he preached revolution. Fans didn't know whether to see him as savior or sellout. Still, one truth remained undeniable. James Brown's music had crossed from dance floors into the bloodstream of a movement. He wasn't just keeping rhythm anymore. He was keeping history. And yet, the more he claimed his throne as the Godfather of soul, the more the man behind the cape grew restless, driven by demons that no stage could silence. Chapter 5. Velvet Shadows. By the 1970s, James Brown was no longer just an entertainer. He was an empire. Hitters poured from him like sermons from a prophet. Sex Machine, Super Bad, Get Up, Get Into It, Get Involved. Every track was sharper, leaner, more hypnotic than the last. The groove had become his kingdom, and funk was his crown jewel. But behind the thunder of his music, shadows gathered. Brown demanded absolute control. His band was an army, drilled like soldiers under a general's glare. He fined them for missing notes, shaved dollars off their pay for mistakes, and ruled the stage with iron fists and flaring tempers. If you're late, you're docked. If you're sloppy, you're gone. Perfection wasn't optional. It was survival in James Brown's world. And yet, the cost of such control was isolation. Band members came and went, sometimes fleeing his discipline, sometimes fired on the spot. Loyalty could never be guaranteed when the man you served was both genius and tyrant. The money flowed in rivers, but it didn't always stay. Brown built radio stations, bought jets, flaunted suits that glittered under the lights. But debt followed close behind. His hunger for empire often outpaced the profits of even his most legendary records. And then came the temptations. Pills for energy, drugs for escape, women for comfort. Fame had given James everything he thought he wanted, but left him restless, unsatisfied, always chasing more. Those close to him saw the cracks, the paranoia, the exhaustion, the violence that sometimes erupted in private moments. The cape he wore on stage began to look less like royalty and more like armor against a world he couldn't trust. Even as disco rose, threatening to overshadow funk, James Brown refused to bow. He reinvented himself again and again, his music sampled, imitated, stolen, yet never equaled. He was still the Godfather, still the spark, still the sound of revolution. But velvet shadows were closing in. His legend was towering, his influence unstoppable. And yet the man himself was unraveling in ways the audience could never see. The question now was not whether James Brown could hold the crown. It was how long he could survive beneath its weight. Chapter 6. A Nation's Mirror. James Brown was more than a man. By the mid-70s, he had become a mirror, reflecting back to America both its power and its contradictions. On one side, he was the embodiment of black pride. His hair, his clothes, his voice, unapologetically rooted in the culture that birthed him. His anthem, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," had already become scripture for a generation. Young black kids who once shrank from the sting of racism now shouted his words like armor. And yet, Brown was no simple revolutionary. He was also a patriot, a businessman, a man who shook hands with presidents and courted power from the very structures that oppressed his people. He played the White House. He posed with Richard Nixon. He invested in businesses designed to prove black self-sufficiency, but also aligned himself with politicians many in his community mistrusted. To some, he was a hero. To others, a traitor. Was he building bridges or protecting his throne? This contradiction defined James Brown. On stage, he demanded unity, discipline, power. Off stage, his life unraveled in chaos. Drugs pulled at him. Violence scarred his private relationships. The iron fist with which he ruled his band sometimes turned inward, leaving even loved ones shaken. Yet even in turmoil, his music never stopped evolving. The grooves grew tighter, stranger, more radical. Songs like "Papa Don't Take No Mess" and "The Payback" dripped with paranoia and defiance. It was as if Brown himself had become both prophet and warning, celebrating black survival while haunted by his own unraveling. And still, America kept looking at him. Because James Brown was the story of America itself, a nation born in poverty and pain, clawing toward greatness, proud yet wounded, explosive yet fragile. By the late 70s, disco was swallowing radio, and funk was being pushed to the edges. But James Brown refused to fade. His sound, raw, urgent, defiant, remained the heartbeat of Black America. The man was crumbling. The music was eternal. And as the 80s dawned, something unexpected happened. A new generation would resurrect James Brown's sound, even as the man himself stumbled deeper into the fire. Chapter 7. A Ghost in the Groove. The 1980s were not kind to James Brown the man. Drugs clawed deeper into his life. Violence and arrests began to stain his reputation. The cape, once a symbol of majesty, now looked like a shield against demons no spotlight could chase away. But while James Brown struggled, his music refused to die. In fact, it found resurrection in a place few expected: hip-hop. Young DJs in the Bronx were spinning his records, cutting up his grooves, looping his beats. The raw drum breaks from songs like Funky Drummer and Give It Up or Turn It Loose became the DNA of a new genre. His screams, his grunts, his rhythms, all lifted, repurposed, reborn. To the kids with turntables, James Brown was more than an old star. He was the heartbeat of the streets. His sound was the skeleton of hip-hop, the pulse that rappers rode like waves. While radio stations moved on, block parties kept his legacy alive. James Brown had become a ghost in the groove, everywhere, even when he wasn't seen. But the man behind the legend was falling apart. In 1988, his most infamous breakdown came. Fueled by drugs and paranoia, he led police on a wild car chase across state lines waving a shotgun. It was chaos, televised and replayed, turning the Godfather of Soul into a punchline in the eyes of some. He was sentenced to prison once again, a tragic echo of the boy who once sang behind bars. And yet, even there, James Brown remained James Brown. He gave interviews, planned comebacks, insisted that his throne was unshakable. When he was released in the early 90s, he stormed back onto stages with the same fire, as if refusing to admit the years had claimed him. But the world had changed. Hip-hop had moved from the streets to the charts, and James Brown's samples ruled the airwaves without his name always being remembered. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, eternal in sound, but fading in flesh. The man was breaking. The myth was indestructible. And as the century turned, James Brown was both prophet and cautionary tale, a legend whose voice could still ignite a crowd, but whose body and spirit carried the scars of a lifetime spent burning at both ends. Chapter 8. Legacy. James Brown died on Christmas Day, 2006, a fittingly dramatic exit for a man who had lived his entire life at theater. The world mourned the Godfather of Soul, but the truth is, he never left. His pulse was already woven into the fabric of modern music. Because James Brown wasn't just an artist, he was an architect. He rebuilt rhythm. He redefined performance. He gave funk its heartbeat, hip-hop its skeleton, pop its electricity. From Michael Jackson's moonwalk to Prince's shrieks, from hip-hop's first DJs to modern R&B producers, the DNA traces back to James Brown's one, the downbeat, the groove, the law he wrote and the world obeyed. His influence is so vast it feels invisible, like oxygen. His screams echo in rap records. His horn stabs live in R&B hooks. His sweat-drenched energy still informs the way performers command a stage. Entire generations move without knowing they are dancing in James Brown's shadow. But the legacy is not only music, it is myth and warning. He embodied Black pride at a time when pride could get you killed. He told a generation of kids to be loud, to be proud, to believe in their power. Yet he also embodied contradiction, a man who preached unity but often ruled with fear, who sought liberation yet clung to control, who gave joy to millions but inflicted pain in private. What do we demand of our voices? We wanted James Brown to be invincible, tireless, perfect. We wanted him to save us with sound. But what do we give back to the ones who burned themselves alive on stage, just to keep us believing? James Brown's legacy forces us to wrestle with that question, because behind the sequins and the capes was still that boy from Barnwell, abandoned, desperate, clawing for light. His genius gave us a soundtrack for survival. His demons remind us that brilliance does not erase pain. And yet, here's the truth. The curtain fell, but the groove never stopped. James Brown may be gone, but his rhythm still moves the earth beneath our feet. We've witnessed the rise of a boy who had nothing, no mother's arms, no father's guidance, no safety net, who clawed his way from brothels and prisons to the biggest stages on earth. We've seen him turn pain into rhythm, hunger into fire, silence into sound. James Brown did not just make music, he altered the shape of time. He taught the world to move on the one. He built grooves that became survival songs, party anthems, protest chants, and global blueprints. But genius has its shadows. The Godfather of soul carried contradictions as heavy as his crown. He was preacher and tyrant, liberator and oppressor, prophet and warning. To love James Brown is to accept that his brilliance and his flaws were inseparable, fused together like rhythm and heartbeat. So what do we do with this story? We honor it. We remember that behind every cape, every split, every scream was a man who demanded to be heard, and who still demands it now. If you felt his power, I want to hear from you. What's your memory of James Brown? The first track that made you move? The performance that left you breathless? The line that still echoes in your mind? Share it. Keep him alive in the chorus of voices that refuse to forget. And if this story shook you, prepare yourself. Because James Brown's fire may have been singular, but his tragedy was not. The soul world is filled with voices who soared too high, burned too fast, and left us with music that still bleeds. If this broke you, wait until we step into the final days of Marvin Gaye, a prophecy of pain that feels almost too heavy to carry. James Brown's cape has fallen, the lights have dimmed, the body is gone. But the groove never dies. The curtain falls, the voice carries on.